Osborne tells us that meals were an important social occasion in the first century, defining peer groups and social status. As the saying went, to share a meal is to share a life. For it was a kind of alliance, a declaration that a person was accepted into a group. Hold that thought. With the possible exception of the Samaritans, it is unlikely that there was a more reviled group of people in ancient Israel than the tax collectors. Tax collectors were almost always wealthy, and their wealth came mostly from extortion and from cheating their fellow Israelites. And so to say they were unpopular would be an understatement. The Pharisees routinely referred to the worst of the worst as the tax collectors and sinners. So their status here is pretty clear. And even Jesus himself would occasionally lump the tax collectors in with people of low repute in order to make a point. He once told the Pharisees that the prostitutes and the tax collectors would enter the kingdom of heaven before them. And when he was speaking of people who love only those who love them, he said even the tax collectors do that. To the Pharisees, tax collectors were sort of the poster child for ritual uncleanness. Due to their regular interactions with Gentiles and their constant handling of foreign money. No good Israelite would associate with a tax collector in any way because the uncleanness of the tax collector would be transferred to the Israelite who associated with them. And so in today's reading, we find Jesus not only calling a tax collector to follow him, but eating at the tax collector's home with the tax collector's friends. This was, according to Osborne, an acceptance of these people by Jesus into his group. And the Pharisees were incensed by this. But they didn't address Jesus directly with their complaints. Instead, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But Jesus heard them, or maybe he just knew their hearts. And he answered them with a statement that is going to become somewhat of a theme in today's reading. "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick," Jesus said. And then he told the Pharisees, "But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." And as Jesus so often does when he speaks to the Pharisees, he answers them directly from the Bible, in this case from the book of Hosea. And the kicker here is the fact that the phrase, "go and learn what this means," was a term that rabbis used to call others to study the Torah. And so in ironic reversal of things, Jesus was admonishing the teachers themselves to go and learn. Our reading today skips over a section where John the Baptist's disciples asked Jesus why his disciples didn't fast, but I went ahead and read it anyway. And while I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this skipped over section, Jesus replies about not using a new piece of cloth to repair an old garment, or about not pouring new wine into old wineskins, and those things will become a critical part of this chapter, so we're going to talk about them a bit more in just a minute. Our reading continues with a story that interrupts another story. A leader of the synagogue comes to Jesus asking for Jesus' help because his young daughter has just died, and the synagogue ruler believes that if Jesus touches her, she will live. Jesus immediately got up and went with the man, but while they were on their way, a woman who had been suffering from bleeding for 12 years surreptitiously approached Jesus and touched the ritual fringes at the edge of his garment, and she was healed. After Jesus told the woman that her faith had healed her, Jesus continued on to the house of the synagogue ruler, where mourners had already gathered and who were, in traditional Hebrew fashion, playing flutes and wailing and crying and generally making a whole lot of noise. Wealthy Israelites actually hired professional mourners to raise that noise level. Jesus commanded them to leave, stating that the girl was asleep, and he said this using a common Hebrew euphemism for death, so I'm not really sure why the mourners laughed at him but they did. And after Jesus threw them out, he took the girl by the hand, and she arose. After hearing these two stories, there are two more things that we need to remember about Jewish purity laws. First is the fact that touching a woman who is bleeding or having her touch you renders you unclean. And the second is that touching a dead person also renders you unclean. And so here, after Jesus has just made himself unclean through his dining with the tax collectors and the sinners, he renders himself unclean a second time when he was touched by the woman who was bleeding, and then he rendered himself unclean a third time when he took the dead girl by the hand. I don't know if we can understand the impact that this would have had on the first century witnesses to these actions, but I would imagine that a pretty big collective gasp would have gone up when it was discovered that Jesus had done something purposely that made him unclean. But you know what? Jesus was setting an example here. The needs of the tax collectors and the sinners to be saved was far more important to Jesus than the following of any ritual law. The needs of the woman who was bleeding to be healed and the needs of the synagogue ruler whose daughter had just tragically died were far more important to Jesus than the need for him to maintain ritual purity. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. The Pharisees' obsession with ritual purity, even though it was grounded in a desire to please God, had become more important to the Pharisees than the actual needs of actual people. Quoting from Osborne again, in both cases, Jesus makes himself ritually unclean, first by being touched by a woman who was bleeding, and second by touching the dead girl. This is often called the hermeneutic of love, meaning a willingness to break Jewish taboos in order to help those who are suffering. And here, too, is a lesson for us that challenges our unwillingness to do the same for the needy. Mercy for the hurting and suffering around us should be the hallmark of the church. And for those who may not be familiar with the theological lingo, hermeneutics describes a method of interpreting things, a way of finding out what things mean. And in this instance, Osborne is declaring that Jesus' words are being interpreted by the love that he pours out on those who are in need. That is the hermeneutic of love. A little earlier, we spoke of cloth patches and old wineskins. I am not the world's greatest handyman. I don't mind trying to fix things, but over the years I have definitely suffered from an occasional lack of knowledge of how to accomplish certain tasks. When Jackie and I moved into our first apartment, there were large glass double doors that opened onto a lovely patio, and there was nothing covering those doors, and so of course there was zero privacy in our apartment. So we went to the store, bought drapes, and came home, and newlywed me screwed the curtain rod into the drywall. The minute I hung the drapes on the rods, the screws pulled out of the drywall and the drapes fell down. I can't tell you how many times over the years that my dad had to teach me how to do something over the phone. Thank goodness for dads, right? Another time I got a brand new sweater. It was a purple sweater and I loved it. And when it eventually got dirty, I threw it in the washing machine. And then I threw it in the dryer. And when it came out of the dryer, it was just about the right size to fit my cat. When subfabrics shrink, they really shrink. And if you can imagine taking a piece of fabric from something that hadn't shrunk yet and using it to make a patch for something that had already shrunk and then washing it, well, that would be a disaster, wouldn't it? And it's probably a good thing that I never tried to make wine, because I never knew that as wine ferments, it expands. Put wine into a new wineskin, and the skin expands with the wine. But put new wine into an old, already expanded wineskin, and it will explode, or so I am told. In both instances, the new is completely incompatible with the old. if you mix the new with the old, you get a disaster. And what we have to learn from our story today is the fact that Jesus has come with a completely new and different way of understanding God's law. A way that places the love and the care for others ahead of ritual or tradition or custom. Do you know how many Presbyterians it takes to change a light bulb? 10. 1 to actually change the bulb, and 9 to stand around and talk about how they like the old bulb much better. Jesus said that he didn't come to change the law. He came to fulfill it. The law was never, ever about ritual or tradition or custom. The law has always been about love. And yet somehow the Pharisees, in their zeal for obeying God's law, lost sight of the fact that the entire law is intended to be interpreted by love. This is what Jesus came to teach us. That the task that faces today's church, the task that faces us, is the task of loving God by loving others. It's the task of recognizing the tax collector's desperate need for salvation and stepping in to address that need, even if that tax collector is extorting and cheating your neighbors or you. It's the task of recognizing the fact that people are hurting, the fact that people need medical attention that they can't afford, that people need food that they can't afford, that people need a place to live that they can't afford. It's about stepping in and addressing not only those individual needs in whatever way we are able, but also about addressing the systems and the injustices that put people into these helpless circumstances in the first place. Why do we think that Jesus was crucified? Why do we think that the first and second century church was persecuted? Why do we think that that portions of the church are still persecuted today? Why do we think that political leaders from Constantine right up to the present day have tried to co-opt the church and water down its radical countercultural message to suit political purposes? All of this is because the new fabric won't patch the old garment. All of this is because the new wine won't fit into the old wineskins. All of this is because a gospel of love won't fit into a religion of ritual or tradition or custom. When this church prays for the folks on the prayer chain, and we do that fervently and persistently, then we become the messengers of that gospel of love. When this church contributes to food banks, or contributes to the folks who are feeding the hungry, or contributes to the various causes our presbytery supports, then we become the messengers of that gospel of love. When we reach out to a neighbor or a friend or an acquaintance and share just a little bit of our faith, or maybe just invite them to come to church with us, then we become messengers of that gospel of love. We don't have to do it all on our own, but we do need to be a part of it. The old ways of simply occupying a pew on Sundays are incompatible with a living, vibrant, active gospel of love. And it is that living, vibrant, active gospel of love that we here at Hope are called to share with the world. A gospel of love that pours out from within these walls and touches all those around us with the love of God that dwells in each of us. Amen.